Good. Now we'll get the important parts. Here we go. Take it away, Chris.
Thanks, Steve. So, and one of the skills that I consistently show is the ability to find ways to put into 10 or 15 words, which some cleverer person would have done in 3. But hence the subtitle to this: Expanding Capacity to Design, Approve, Build, and Maintain Trails in Alaska. And we do have a really skilled and experienced panel that's going to walk us through that subject. And I think what I may do is just go ahead and have them briefly introduce themselves. They prepared brief and helpful bios, but I think what we'll do is when we go into this discussion, let them briefly do that themselves. Those are the folks you can see: Ryan O'Shaughnessy with Trail Mix in Juneau, Ben Huey, Sitka Trail Works, Elizabeth Thomas, Tlingit Haida Central Council, and then Bryant giving us some good geographic diversity from Fairbanks. Our agenda, not lacking for words there, but I'm going to do what I'm doing now, and mostly I'm close to being done with, introduce the topic. Ben's going to give us a brief overview of sort of the bigger picture issues and opportunities around this topic. And then we have 3 case studies, all orbiting around sort of a hypothesis that the solution to these workforce challenges is these entities that can bring together an aggregate funding from multiple sources, can leverage that funding, and then provide kind of a sustainable basis for ongoing operations. The heart of the solution, I think that's starting to seem like a sellable hypothesis on that subject. They're going to share examples in those 3 locations. And then we want to use the remainder of our time in the neighborhood of 20 minutes to, with the participation of those on the call, to ask these questions. So I'll be asking those of the panelists, and we can explore some of the details and get questions asked and answered about the case studies you've seen. So with that, I'm going to pass it to Ben and let him talk through this topic.
Great.
Thanks, Ben.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, so Ben Huey here. I grew up here in Sitka and have been working in the public lands space more or less since being on a trail crew for Sitka Trail Works in high school. Spent time in Washington State in a nonprofit and in Washington, D.C. working on policy. But I moved back to town during COVID to lead a conservation corps that was funded by the CARES Act, and last year moved to take over Sitka Trail Works. So I think everyone understands the real opportunity because we all know the story of the Civilian Conservation Corps. The CCC is this widely popular. Public opinion polls still show broad public support for this kind of public investment of giving people living wage jobs that advance their careers and help them give back to the community. A model that ends up with creating infrastructure that supports, especially in Southeast Alaska here, a visitor economy, as well as community recreation and health. It's this win-win-win model that we know works when governments prioritize this kind of investment. When we ran a corps, the Sitka Conservation Society was leading that. When we ran that in 2020, we were on the front page of the news, the local news here, like every week, because people just loved the story. It really resonated. You give displaced workers a hand and do great things in the community. People appreciated the work, and they appreciated the fact that locals were given the opportunity to contribute. It was a tremendous success, and on the scheme of public investments is not outlandish compared to a lot of the other things we invest in. Unfortunately, nonprofits can't just do this on their own. I would love to, as Sitka Trail Works, to just launch a core program that had great paying wages and training and was a reliable thing that people come back to year after year. We don't have the certainty and sustainability of funding streams, and the color of the money that comes in isn't adequate or appropriate for the kind of workforce focus, the people focused investments we want to make. here at Sitka Trailworks, we actually have 3 big projects this summer, but they don't add up or piece together to make it possible to hire, 6 people for the whole summer, which is needed if you're going to have a crew program. We have a Department of Transportation Federal Lands Access Program grant, which is mostly heavy excavation, which kind of removes it from our conservation or our like trail crew funding schemes. We also have a challenge cost share with the Forest Service, and we have a recreational trails program grant with the state. But those fairly modest and project specific grants that can't be applied to general workforce support don't add up to create a crew program for a season. This is the threshold difficulty in small communities, especially where the additional funding streams like municipal support, we get a few thousand from the city and borough of Sitka every year as a nonprofit, but that doesn't create a significant portion of a salary for perhaps like a field manager that you would want to keep around for a longer season and be able to guarantee that employment in future years. So we can't stack all these little grants on top of each other to create a season. Ultimately, we would love to be able to guarantee employment that was something you could come back to, so that people could know that they can grow a career and become as an inexperienced worker, learn some of the on the ground skills, and then blossom into a project manager, or maybe even go on to write grants and find funding themselves. These are the kind of skill sets that these agencies, our Forest Service, National Park Service partners need, but it's difficult for a trail worker to get there because we're not sure if we're going to have a crew next season. So that's a bit of the problem statement, and I'll pass it on. Are you next, Ryan, maybe?
Yeah, and I can run it at this end. The one thing I might add to that really helpful overview, Ben, is part of the context for the opportunities and the challenges you've put forward is that Alaska broadly has had very minimal funding, and you've kind of hit on that, for trails work, for construction, for maintenance of trails. And simultaneously, the demand for trails has just continued to grow and grow and grow. And then suddenly now there actually is more money for the construction side. And so we have this mismatch between demand and desire for trails. We even have some money to do that work, but the workforce that we have, I'm doing some helpful arm motions here, is tied to that sort of, almost starvation diet of the past. And so that's where all the challenges you just articulated are in this new world where we are lagging behind the capacity of our workforce to meet the demands. And with that, I'll go ahead and hit advance and let Ryan take over and start to tell us about what's going on in one of the 3 case studies. And I like these images just because we've got some serious erosion. I've understood it rains in Southeast occasionally, and that the trail building process is a little more challenging in the woods than say on an alpine ridge that is like decomposed rock. It's already a trail. So with that, Ryan, tell us about your world.
Thanks, Chris, and thank you, Ben. That was a really succinct description of a large and heady problem, and I'm excited to dig into it with all of you. So my name is Ryan O'Shaughnessy. I'm the executive director at Trail Mix Incorporated here in Juneau. We build trails here on Linkit Ani. Primarily, the trails that we build are on the lands of the Akwaan. I've been with Trail Mix since 2015. I started with Trail Mix as a trail crew leader and have worked my way through the roles of project manager. And like I said, now I'm the executive director. So what Ben said about working through that pipeline really resonates with me. And I am really interested in exploring how to recreate those kind of pipelines and shore them up to make sure that those kinds of things are sustainable.
Ryan, just because I can't resist interrupting, do you have is there an emblem on your skin, perhaps like even a tattoo that shows your devotion to the the trail mix
Yeah,
cause.
lots of tattoos here.
But isn't there actually like the official trail mix tattoo?
Yeah, there's one back there somewhere.
That was an important diversion. Thank you.
Yeah, totally. So what I'd like to do is share a little bit of background on trail mix and sort of some of the key pieces inside of our relationship with some of our core partners that have allowed us to build our capacity to the point where we do have year-round staff and consistent seasonal trail crews year over year. So very briefly, in 1993, Trail Mix was formed out of a municipal-led planning effort, which addressed our area-wide trails and how to collaboratively manage them between agencies. Like a lot of places in Alaska, the land management boundaries look a lot like a checkerboard, and our trails tend to run through them. And a lot of times, despite best efforts and best intentions, municipal agencies and state agencies and federal agencies don't often have the same management standards. So this 1993 plan called for the creation of a nonprofit that would facilitate the collaboration and cooperation and co-management of trails, primarily on the Juneau road system. Like I said, it was all volunteer at that point. In 1998, there was a pretty significant restructuring that happened. The city and the Forest Service, state parks, and to some extent national parks kind of looked at this model and were like, this is working, and we're getting a lot of work done, but we need more capacity. We need something to sustain this. So with funding from a few sources, Trail Mix was able to hire a full-time executive director and start to hire some seasonal trail crew, although in the beginning it was really spotty. The piece of funding that I'd like to focus on for this conversation at that point in 1998 was the commitment of commercial user fees from CBJ Parks Land, some tours that were happening on CBJ Parks Land to Trail Mix. The municipality recognized that there was this source of income from tour operators who were taking primarily cruise ship tourists on tours and using CBJ trails. They passed that funding along to Trail Mix to maintain the trails, and kind of looked at it as a grant and said, let's get some capacity going. There's been a lot of history with this. Let's take it to the next level. So with that, the organization saw a lot of success. Again, we were able to hire a full-time executive director. We were able to plan projects much more efficiently, as you can imagine, with paid staff rather than exclusively volunteers. And the city saw a lot of return on investment from that initial investment of, I think, $23,000 in 1998. So fast forward a couple of years to 2001, the CBJ was seeing year-over-year return on investment from this pass along of commercial user fees, and decided to codify that contribution as an annual grant, and started making an annual grant of $40,000 to Trail Mix to be present, to be responsive, and to be able to have the capacity to respond to issues on our trail system as they arose. Fast forward again, a whole nother 20 years, and this has been going on for a while. And through that time, there's a lot of trust built, a lot of relationships were built, and there was a lot of trust. And when we got into the pandemic, we've talked a lot about the COVID-19 Conservation Corps, and I'm going to stay away from the specifics of that programming because I think everyone on this call has heard quite a bit about it, and I could go on for days. But a key piece of that COVID-19 Conservation Corps was that it focused on workforce development and job skills training. So we were able to take that funding from the city and implement that and provide training, pay living wage for our crew members, and grow our capacity as an organization. And so with all this history, I'm excited to talk about the impacts that relationship has had, that sustained funding has had, and imagine some ideas with this group for where that can go forward. And I'd like to also just acknowledge that, we have had a lot of that is a lot of success with our partner, the city. And a lot of that is due to time. We've had 30 years for this relationship to really marinate and to grow and evolve. So we're very fortunate to, one, have had that amount of time, and also be in a place like Juneau that has a little more resources than more rural places in Alaska. So, we do recognize that our solution is not a silver bullet, but we are excited to share the story with y'all.
Next slide.
Yes, please. Yep. So, oh, sorry, Chris, you're one ahead of me there.
Okay.
Perfect. So just a little bit of how our relationship works with the city. I just wanted to unpack, I talked about how that relationship has evolved and is structured. And I just wanted to unpack that a little bit for a little bit of clarity. So when we work with the CBJ Parks and Recreation, the CBJ commits funding for trail projects through their Trail CIP fund. Trail mix is reimbursed for labor at a rate of twice minimum wage. And I'll come back to that in just a little bit. And CBJ purchases all of the materials for the trail projects. We participate in planning efforts, and that process is really solidified in an MOA, as well as an annual work plan that we work with Parks and Recreation staff to implement and to create. One of the things that we learned, Chris, sorry, now you can hit the slide. That was a quick one. So some of the things that we've learned as this relationship and the sustained funding has given us the ability to grow our capacity as an organization and then was really, really honed in on by the COVID-19 Conservation Corps, is that relying on that sustained funding is huge to build our capacity and allows us to start thinking about things like, how can we pay a minimum wage rather than just how can we line up projects for the summer? And so having that sort of foundation in place, I think, is really key. As Chris mentioned, there's so much funding coming down right now. And we've been on, the trails community has been on the starvation diet for such a long time that it's hard to grapple with large amounts of funding as a small organization. Even TrailMix with, our long history, some of these larger federal grants are really difficult for us to consider applying for. And there's a lot of barriers there. So just really implement and emphasize how critical this capacity building is as we kind of enter this new era, this historic era of funding. So through our relationship with the city, we've had this foundation and it's been really great. Enter 2020 and our COVID-19 Conservation Corps, we really put the rubber to the road with that program, and we really implemented some of these capacity building ideas that had sort of been floating in the ether for a while. As all of you probably recall, there was a lot of federal benefits for unemployment, increased unemployment benefits. And in order to compete with that, as part of the COVID-19 Conservation Corps, we raised our wages. We were paying our crew members $19 an hour. And we saw a huge applicant pool. And from that program, we saw tons of retention. We focused on job skills training, on certifications for our crew members, and we've seen incredible retention. This year, we only had to hire 3 out of 15 seasonal positions. We had 60 applications for those 3 positions. That's really incredible. That really lets us come into this field season with a really well-trained, certified crew, with staff being able to focus more on planning and thinking about grant opportunities and project opportunities, and has really started to turn the flywheel so that we can grow as an organization. Some of the challenges that we're still facing is that trail work is still largely seasonal, and there's not a great there's not a great counterpart for winter operations for this staff that we're training. So we're seeing folks go to standard things, go to in Juneau, we have Eagle Crest, the ski area, going to hospitality. And so that's a challenge, and that is definitely a tough part of growing our capacity is there's not a lot of counterpart seasonal opportunities for our seasonal staff. The other piece of this is that there are just limited opportunities due to this, again, starvation diet and limited capacity for all of us, right? There's just not a lot of trail planning, trail management positions in the state. And so, while there is in trail work, there's so many things that a person who's doing trail work as a summer job out of high school or college can learn about, can become excited about, natural resource management, tourism, hydrology, geology, construction, you name it. There's so much that can come from that. But keeping this talent and this training that we're developing inside of the outdoor recreation infrastructure and trail world is something that I see as a challenge. So I know I haven't really presented a great solution to this, and I know it is kind of ethereal, and I think it really takes a community to think about these things and make change. So I'm excited to hear from the next two case studies, and I'm excited to think about some of the questions as a group that Chris has put in front of us. So thanks everyone for your time, and I'll hand it back to Chris.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. I'm just going to say you like exactly on 10 minutes. You get extra bonus points as a panelist for that. The one detail that you mentioned to me earlier, and maybe I missed you saying it, but if I remember correctly, initially Juneau's logic for putting money in was it was tied to the revenue that came from the commercial use permits that they were issuing. But at some point, they gave you more money than that, and they no longer tried to make that connection because they saw the broader benefit independent of the revenue they were directly generating. Take a minute and make sure I understand that right.
Sure. Yeah, I think that you have that right, and I'll just kind of go back to that a little bit. So you nailed it. So essentially, the city was seeing this revenue, this commercial revenue from trails, and passed that along to an established nonprofit partner to maintain those same trails. After a few years of this, there was a real one-to-one benefit, and the city was really seeing the impact from that. Right around the same time, whale watching and visiting our wonderful Mendenhall Glacier recreation area just became more popular than taking folks on trails with the cruise ship folks. So there was actually a little bit of a drop off there. But the city and the public had really seen a huge impact from that programming. So I think it was the one-to-one tie between the commercial user fees was a great first step to really justify a public expense on trails, because as we all know on this call, it's tough to get. And so it was a great way for the public to see this direct impact. And so there was that recognition later on in 2001 that, hey, even though we are going to contribute what commercial user fees we do have, this is something we need to support. Yeah, I had another thought there, but it's fled now.
Okay, well, I'll pass it on to Elizabeth in this great inverted pyramid. So take it away, Elizabeth.
Hey, thanks, Chris. Hi, everyone. My name's Elizabeth Thomas. I am the Natural Resource Coordinator at Clinton-Haida Central Council. And I am here in Juneau, Alaska. And I guess, I don't know how to connect from Ryan's, but I grew up in Juneau. I grew up on trails and kind of went on this path of, I think, trying to find, I think, like my own development through trail work and stuff at an early age. And I just went back and finished my degree in environmental studies. And today, the case study that we're looking at is Alaska Youth Stewards. And I think I look at things in reverse, like the problem first. Oops, my screen's freezing up, sorry. When we're talking about trails and capacity and workforce development, I think of the need for land stewardship that aligns with cultural values, and then the recognition of the problem, and then action taken through land stewardship.
I'll take a pause as move to the next slide. Tell me.
Sorry, and if anyone wants to interject at any time, please do so.
Yeah. And maybe use the chat for now with that. I like that request, Elizabeth, but we'll we'll have a more open
Okay.
discussion, but if you've got a question along the way, by all means, drop it in the chat. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm a little nervous too, so this might be a little awkward.
You're doing
But
great.
yeah, please interrupt me, and then I feel more open to converse and interact that way. So here I've just kind of laid out like what the timeline looks like for Alaska Youth Stewards. And basically, when we look at stewardship, you know, as we all know, there was youth stewardship that took place for millennia, and then and what this case study looks at with Alaska Youth Stewards, by meeting the needs of workforce development, communities and individuals came together and created youth crews in 2015. And then collaboration of youth crews to create AYS in 2019. And that was a number of partnerships, in particular SSP, Southeast Sustainable Partnership, to kind of collaborate and oversee these as an umbrella for smaller programs in various communities in Goon and Cake and Prince of Wales. And then just recently, this fall of 2021, also in partnership with Spruce Root, Click and Haida established an agreement with Spruce Root to oversee this umbrella of programs. And then today, 2022, is Alaska Youth Stewards. So sorry if that didn't make sense, but
No, that made sense just
okay.
fine. So I'll go on to the next slide.
Yeah, sure. And here I'm just reiterating. So the mission of Alaska Youth Stewards is to create an experience that provides educational and workforce development for the youth in rural communities in Alaska. And then in this diagram, I just showed different components and why it's beneficial to collaborate.
I'm pausing to just appreciate that diagram. It seems like it captures a lot of things in a really direct and helpful way. So
Yeah, so with these, I mean, not even smaller programs, but I think in the natural resource field in general, we were just talking about this yesterday in a meeting with Parks and Recs, how we're using our resources to get resources to get resources. And so with the collaboration, as there is with so many of these organizations and institutions, and it's kind of a no-brainer to come together and collaborate those. And I think with the shift in COVID, it's a disadvantage, but also an advantage that we're able to work, you know, from Juneau to Sitka to Anchorage, and bring those together, bring these ideas together, and create a solution for establishing or reestablishing land stewardship in our communities.
Yeah.
And so this, and I think you have access to that, Chris, but I'm kind of a nerd and I really like story mapping. So I wanted to highlight this, not only because I like story mapping, but so this demonstrates what the Youth Stewards programs have worked on. And I think it's a cool way to track their and report their projects, and also, you know, interact with each other.
Is there one particularly I might touch on and pull up some information?
So I think that link, if you click on story mapping project, unless I botched it. Ben set it up the other day.
Is everyone seeing the screen? I think maybe I have to stop and then reopen. So excuse me, that's what I wasn't doing.
Sorry.
Give me 2 seconds because it popped right up on mine. And then, of course, I imagine you were seeing it when you weren't. Now perhaps you are?
Oh, yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, sorry for that
Yeah.
glitch on my side.
Yeah, sorry, I don't want to complicate it, but I just think
No,
this is
no,
a really
it's
cool
totally cool.
thing. So it shows, and it's a little hard to see, but it shows each, community that's has the youth stewardship program, and then different projects they're working on, or there's some really interesting, and we could share the link in the chat, I suppose, but
Yeah, and I'm just pulling up, and I'm not sure if the stop share
yeah,
is allowing you to see that each of these color-coded points is tied to a story about, the one I'm on now. This year, we brought back the YCC career leaders from the previous season, and it goes on from there. So great tool.
yeah. So as you can see, there's that image was of kayaking, and so these programs don't only provide trail work, which is essentially the goal. I think I skipped over that, but different life skill building as well, and provides an experience that, they'll bring on into their adult lives, how to solve problems, and build relationships, and so forth. So I'm really excited. I just came in this position 2 months ago, and I don't know if Tia's on, but we just hired a youth catalyst specialist that's essentially taking over Laurel Stark from Spruce Root's position, to help coordinate these awesome programs.
So
But one thing that is part of the struggle, going back to the issues with capacity and resources, is that we spend so much time, like every year or every 3 to 5 years, applying for these, and it's time consuming, and so that's a hurdle, or I guess, I don't know, a resource leech, that in another discussion with the Forest Service that has brought up, how can we get through this? Some of these, when they're federally funded programs, how can we, make it more beneficial for communities with smaller resources, such as Cake and these smaller communities. And so I think it's really, I hope it's beneficial for all the programs to begin this relationship with Clinton Haida Central Council. And yeah, I'm looking forward to, I think everyone's kind of wanting to continue and expand on providing experiences for the youth that will help them go on to work in natural resource management fields.
Well, thanks so much, Elizabeth. Thanks. This is a super exciting program. And all of these we could unpack for longer and longer, more detail, but I'll drive forward and let Bryant fill in the last of our 3 case studies.
Hey everyone, I'm Bryant Wright. I'm the Trails Coordinator for Fairbanks North Star Borough Parks and Rec. Really fascinating to hear from Juneau and Sitka in the Southeast. Those programs are really impressive, very robust. I'm going to talk a bit about where Fairbanks is kind of in these respective timelines of how do you get from a community that has a bunch of trails to a community that takes care of all those trails. So Chris, if you don't mind popping back to that first slide real quick.
Did I go past it? Oh yeah, excuse me.
I think,
I did,
no worries.
unintentionally.
One more back. Great, yeah. So Fairbanks, we have a lot of trails, a lot of people that use them. The Fairbanks North Star Borough Parks and Rec Department manages 3 major recreation areas. We have staff at those areas. That's Tanana Lakes, Chena Lake, and Birch Hill. You can tell by the lake addition to those names, these are rec areas that have all kinds of recreation going on, boating, some beaches, fishing, And we have trails there too. We've got trails that are pretty accessible to novice users, pretty flat areas, pretty beefed up, hardened trails. They don't require tons of maintenance. We've really got them fairly set up to be sustained by the few staff that work in those areas. So these aren't like trail experts, just staff that can kind of keep care of basic issues, fix a culvert, get rid of a hazard tree here and there. Birch Hill is one of our other major recreation areas. That is a major trail system for Nordic skiing in the winter, kind of like Anchorage's Kincaid Park. Got world-class Nordic ski trails there. And we do have staff that help maintain the grounds and facilities at Birch Hill, the buildings and whatnot, but we rely on a long-term relationship, a formalized relationship with our Nordic Ski Club, again, similar to Kincaid. So the Nordic Ski Club's taking care of those trails. So yeah, as far as like formally established trail systems that have staff to help out, those are our rec areas. We've also got some trail or nature areas, land owned in fee simple by the borough, that have really popular trail systems, but we don't have any staff maintaining those. That's at Iceberg Recreation Area, Skyline Ridge Park. So 2 nice trail systems. Each of them have, I don't know, 3 to 5 miles of developed trail in various states of improvement or disrepair. But yeah, no staff taking care of those trails. Sometimes we'll get grant funded projects to take care of like major renovations there. That's kind of what we rely on, and then just informal volunteer care. What's pretty unique in the borough is the mileage of trail that kind of crisscrosses properties everywhere. And Ryan alluded to this in Juneau. We've got a similar thing in Fairbanks, very much a patchwork of land ownership, and our trail systems are crossing all kinds of land. So the borough takes on a role to plan for the trails that crisscross our area. We have a comprehensive recreational trail plan. It gives the borough some guidance on how it might manage or protect those trails. The current trail plan has about 60 trails that includes almost, if not a little more than 1,000 miles right now. We're updating that plan right now. We're adding trails to that plan. The major function of the borough and this plan is to help protect access to trails that cross other properties, non-borough properties, non-public lands. So this is kind of the realm I work in mostly. So in kind of that timeline of, a community developing around trails, developing trails in its community, beginning to adopt them and care for them, we're really still very early in the stages of this. And that is because we don't have public access to many, many miles of these trails. So that keeps us from being able to maintain them, manage them like the community wants, enter into formal agreements with volunteers, spend capital funds on these trails because we just don't have legal access to lots of them. 1,000 miles is a lot. A little over 30 miles they lack public access. That doesn't seem like much of a percentage of that total mileage, but the problem is if you've got a long trail, a linear feature that has a gap in legal access, we can't really proceed with any projects. So if 1% of that trail doesn't have public access, we can't really spend funds, public funds on that trail, sending people into that corridor, essentially into trespass. So that's been a major barrier for us. We have a lot of those gaps to close up. Right now, people are using the trails. They use the trails throughout town, but they just pretty much survive on informal volunteer maintenance because, again, we can't really formalize things until we have that legal access. So Chris, you can hop to the next slide there. Oh, and that image of all the trails and the comments just kind of illustrates that we are in the process right now of updating that plan and inventorying and evaluating all the trails around us. So right now we've got some major systemic needs. Number one is getting that access. Until we have the legal access to a trail in its entirety, we can't proceed with steps 2 and 3, so to speak. We can't start really managing it and maintaining the trails. It's not really worth setting policies or maintenance protocols if we can't spend money on them or send staff to them. But once we do get the legal access, then we can start rebuilding trails. We can develop them so that they're usable and inviting. We can maintain them or work with a partner to support their maintenance of the trails. So we're looking for places to do that. Most often we are confined to those few rec areas that I mentioned in the beginning, and just kind of filling in gaps there. Once we do manage them, once we do maintain them after having legal access, that's when we can really put efforts into outreach, promote the use of the trails, send people to the trails. Again, there are a lot of people using the trails throughout town. A lot of people live here for the trails, but a lot of people don't really know what opportunities are there and can hardly find information if they look. Again, that's because we're not making any information or sending it out because we can't encourage people to go into trespass there. So that's really been a challenge. We're still trying to get to that step 3, trying to identify those places where we have legal access so that we can at least begin building this kind of trail culture in town for what we do have access to. The kinds of maintenance needs are probably similar here to other places. Lots of overgrown trails, lots of brushing needed, and then a lot of poor soils, a lot of really wet areas. One of the reasons this is kind of important to note is that the solutions to those problems right now are oftentimes kind of beyond our volunteer capacity. Fastest way to brush a trail is use equipment, use chainsaws, use power cutting tools. We don't really love to hand chainsaws to volunteers. I know we heard a lot about that from some of the other agencies or organizations doing trail volunteer maintenance. And then the poor soils, the solutions for those involves bringing a lot of gravel in or installing major drainage features or just completely realigning the trail. Oftentimes that's most efficiently done with larger equipment. And so we kind of have found that it's most efficient for us to do more of a capital level project, to find grant funding to replace these poorly degraded features. So Chris, you can go to the next slide there. A major opportunity that has come up recently is through our borough's capital improvement plan. For as long as I've known, we haven't really had any trail centric projects in this plan. We've been raising the profile by trying to get to that 3rd step, trying to get outreach, trying to promote the use of the trails that we do have access to. And I think by raising the profile a bit in town of our trail use and our love for trails, we've gotten the attention of our administration, of our assembly. And through this capital improvement program, we finally have a mechanism to fund access projects, to take care of that first step so that we can move forward with trail development and trail maintenance. We're calling this our Trail a Year funding program. It's kind of a challenge to articulate this as a capital project, because the first thing we need really is design work. It's surveying and it's negotiating with landowners to purchase easements, to purchase right-of-way or interests in non-borough properties so that we can dedicate those corridors for public access. So this funding program, it's just kicked off this budget year. We haven't started a project yet, so we're just working on a project list. But so far, it's slated to provide $350,000 a year towards securing public access to the borough's trail system. That trail system is defined in our comprehensive recreational trail plan. So that's like the foundation. We have this plan. We just needed a mechanism to fund the access projects that we need to move forward. So this would be phased annually. We'll take one, maybe two of our priority trail routes as identified in the trail plan. We'll survey those. We'll hire for design work. We'll hire the survey crew to precisely identify where these trails go on different properties, and then we can work with the landowner. The surveying costs have been a big barrier. It's hard to find a landowner who is willing to provide trail access. Once you do, then you're asking them to pay a lot of money to survey that area so that we can define where that legal corridor is. So, you lose a lot of interest when you start racking up the costs for a landowner. So we're trying to compensate landowners through this program. And once we have that access, we can also use this funding to kind of build the physical access, to install a trailhead, to put signage and wayfinding so that the public knows that this is a place that they're invited to use, and then also restore degraded trails. So it's really, it's filling in that missing link with this, cute knotted clip art on the chain there.
Yeah, it's a good one.
Yeah, Chris, you can go to the next slide.
Okay.
So once we kind of work through these access issues, then we can start entertaining some of these really great programs that the other presenters described with, relationships with nonprofits and building trail crews. Right now, what we're envisioning through our trail plan process is kind of a three-legged stool approach. We need a combination. And I think this has been described by many others today. You can't have just volunteers. You can't do everything with contractual labor. You can't do everything with staff. You can try, and there are models that approach it that way, but we're finding for us, we need this three-pronged approach. We need staff to coordinate our contractual projects, to apply for grants, to manage a contract, to build the specifications for an invitation for bid. And those contractors have resources that we don't have. They have equipment. Many of them have expertise that our staff don't have. They've got the time and they've got the ability to quickly hire a crew within a month's notice and put together what they need to get a project done. The staff have the understanding of what we need, the understanding of the inventory of issues in our trail system, the expertise for trail design. But we only have one staff in our trails office, and that's me. We don't have staff that are mobilized to go work on trails. They already have responsibilities in our parks and rec areas. So we need additional capacity in order to do more projects, even with contractors. In particular, we need more capacity to work with volunteers. That requires an incredible amount of staff coordination, especially to do volunteer projects more regularly, so that you can build the expertise in the community. The volunteers also need support. They can't afford some of the volunteer organizations can't afford the kinds of the amounts of materials we need to fix trails, the kinds of equipment it might take to fix trails, or the insurance that it would require to perform the kinds of work that need to be done. So we're envisioning this kind of three-pronged approach. Again, we got to start with the access issues first, and then we can kind of move into really trying to develop a trail program that utilizes these three types of labor. Anyway, that's where we're at with the borough, hoping to see more progress after this Trail a Year program kicks off.
That's exciting. It's a big leap forward, Brian. So I'm glad to hear that, and thanks for the update. So I'm going to take us to the next slide, and was just informed by Steve that if we if people want to stick around, even though 11:45 is the official ending point of this, the next session is not until 1. So obviously, if people needed to get away by then, feel free to do so. But we've got some questions we wanted to raise to the panelists, and also to get some more questions coming in from people in the audience. So maybe I'll just kind of whip through this list, and maybe people just raise their hand, and or Steve, you see a chat question between you, Steve, and myself. We can take in some questions from the audience as well as the panelists. And I think we've heard some answers on that first question, and maybe Elizabeth, you and or Ryan might talk about how to work these issues where you have a big city like Juneau, but how do you also pull that off in a Cake or an Angoon or in a little community in Prince of Wales Island, and wondering about, might there be trail organizations, not just at the community level that has the capacity, but maybe at the sub-regional or regional scale. Any thoughts on that? Any of the panelists?
I'll take a quick pass at that. And then I do think that looking at AYS is probably a much better picture than Trail Mix. But I just wanted to echo that I think that partnerships are just so key to everything. I think that's one thing that I've really taken away from the pandemic, is that while we're all increasingly more isolated, has really highlighted the need for more connection and more community partnerships with tribal governments, with nonprofit organizations, with municipalities, you name it. I think that partnerships are key.
Yeah,
that's my 2 cents.
And Elizabeth, you folks seem to be really one of the few examples I'm seeing in this state of being able to extend that kind of regional capacity into smaller locations. Maybe you could explain a little bit about how you're pulling that off.
Yeah, and kind of got nervous at the beginning of my presentation, but I think the purpose of my first slide was to demonstrate that to succeed and create solutions, you obviously need a passionate individual and or organization, and then taking action and collaboration. And I think adaptability, being able to move and shift with the resources you have is, I think, the success in these different groups that are now AYS.
Does the AYS structure, like when you were showing us those encouraging pictures of youth working in pretty diverse locations, does the AYS have a paid staff? Maybe this is going to Bryant's diagram. You can send out a volunteer leader, coordinator, the field crew leader. How's that structured?
Is that to AYS? Sorry.
Yeah, I was thinking maybe,
yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, so there's a collaboration of multiple different organizations in each group, but also there is at least one crew leader to lead the crew, and they are paid positions. Yeah. And
that the number and the ability of those folks has increased recently with sort of growing funding. It seems like the AYS program continues to expand. Yeah, and I don't know if Bob and Laurel, as I'm so new, it is expanding, but if anyone wants to chime in on that. Bob, Laurel, if you're on and want to maybe add a bit about how this program through Sustainable Southeast Partnership and Spruce Root, illustrating what Ryan said about these partnerships and how they grow and create capacity, just to put you on the spot, if you're there and willing to share a few words, that'd be great.
Yeah, this is Laurel with Spruce Root and SSP, and I have had the honor and privilege of being able to support some of the coordination efforts of AYS over the past couple years. And I really appreciated, I know Brian's kind of perspective of that three-pronged approach. I think that's something that we really see as helpful here too. As Elizabeth was sharing, right, these programs are like community owned. So, in Hoona, it's the Hoona Indian Association that runs their program. In Cake, it's the Organized Village of Cake. In Angoon, the Chatham School District runs the program. And so those are the actual employers of the crew members. And, I think making sure that the people are paid well is really important. But then they're coordinating on the ground, whether that's the crew leader or members of the community that have been involved, are offering their time and expertise to do additional activities. And now I think it's really exciting with Tia on board, as Elizabeth was saying, like having a devoted staff person to specifically support that coordination of the efforts across communities. But there are so many people that are involved, like See Alaska has been a major contributor. The Sustainable Southeast Partnership is a collective impact network. So there are tribes, businesses, nonprofits, so many different partners that are able to offer expertise or resources in terms of funding, personnel, just being able to connect to different opportunities and being able to tap into those different resources, I think has been really helpful, and something that it sounds like so many other folks are tapping into as well. You can see that as well. Thanks.
Chris, if you wouldn't mind me jumping in, I just wanted to add a tiny bit of emphasis to what Laurel said to address the importance of tribal governments in these partnerships. As a trails nonprofit, we have a somewhat limited mission, and AYS is able to offer environmental restoration and a bunch of different other work projects, as well as that workforce, human-focused perspective, in part because of those tribal governments are addressing holistic well-being of the community, which is a much broader mission than a single trails nonprofit. So I just wanted to add that. I think they're a great partner.
Yeah, actually, Ben, I was going to try to say something like that as well. It's and interestingly, leaping back to the keynote yesterday morning, talking about the Long Trail, Teresa Martinez, based in New Mexico, if many of you might have heard that, talked about the Continental Divide Trail and how they really are seeing themselves, I think, almost in a similar light of sort of community-driven resilience, economic health, a whole category, a whole suite of needs and opportunities that are linked back in many cases to trails. But because of the diversity of those missions, maybe they are able to secure more funding and bring along more public support. And I really liked what you'd said, Elizabeth, resources for resources. That's maybe the phrase of the day. But before I yammer further, Chris, Myrtle, you had a hand up and a question or a thought.
I do. Great. Thanks, Chris. Hey, I just wanted to follow up on what Ryan said. This is Chris Myrtle, landscape architect with Corvus down in Juneau. The federal government, state government, nonprofits have been screaming for recreation money for decades. It's here, it's coming fast, and it's going to come out like a fire hose. And like Ryan said, we've really got to have an effort moving forward that we create the partnerships. We can't do this each individually as single nonprofits. We need to find all the people on this call and everybody that's been part of the conference to realize who's the best at each task and who is having fun at that task. Who is the best person? Nobody wants to do accounting if you're not an accountant, and that gets you fired up. So, we really need to call on all of the resources, because this fire hose is going to hit us so hard and fast, and no one person or one group can deal with it. So I just want to say, reach out to everybody. If you need someone to do design work, reach out to people who do design work. You've got trail builders, you've got youth groups, people that have to go and do research on easements and do survey. Don't try to do everything. Do what you do best and do what you enjoy doing. And I think that's so important, because this is a huge opportunity for the state. And as I said, we've been screaming for recreation way back when I was in the Forest Service in the early 90s. And it's finally here. But guess what? There's not enough people to deal with it. But collectively, we can make it happen. Anyway, so really appreciate all the conversation.
No, thanks for saying that, Chris. And I think what you just said is the underlying motivation for this session of going from this starvation diet to they're inverse. Suddenly there's a lot of opportunity, but our workforce capabilities are back to what they've been in those days of no funding. And like you've just said, the ability to bring all of the different resources and partners together is probably the best and only possible way we're going to take advantage of the opportunities that the funding is providing. Laurel, you have a thought?
Yeah, just a follow up to that, Chris. I think, right, there is so much funding and opportunity that's happening right now. And something that I think has been really helpful for AYS is that I've only been involved in this program for the past 2 years, but there was so much time, relationship development, trust building that happened before that some of the partnerships have been in place for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. And so really taking advantage, reaching out to people now about the opportunities that are here now, but also thinking about what could this look like in 100 years, in 200 years, what's the groundwork that we can be laying for the trails to come and those opportunities. Thanks.
So I've been trying to make notes on sort of themes that have come up, and one that came out from a couple of quarters. And please, if you've got questions, don't hesitate. That's more interesting than me trying to think of something to say. But the point you made, Bryant, and I think maybe in effect, Ryan, you the same, was the trigger for $350,000 a year or for launching Sitka Trailworks was a plan that elevated the importance and the understanding of trails. And Bryant, did I hear you right on that? Was that kind of the catalyst? Suddenly the decision makers, the assembly groups that had not been necessarily thinking about this stuff went, our constituents and our economy, blah, blah, blah. Bryant, maybe you could help.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're partially right, at least with the borough. That's certainly the foundation. You've got to have the plan that is that formal way of saying the public wants this, the people in your community, your constituents want this. But that plan can sometimes hibernate quietly in the background and not really receive a lot of attention. And that really has been the case with the borough. Our plan was originally drafted in 1985. And since our major advisory board for trails has been calling for funding for trail access for surveying for decades since then, and nothing, just crickets from the administration assembly. I think the thing that took it to the next level was really kind of doing programming to highlight the trails and call attention to them, call attention to what was in the plan, to the resource that we had, to how people are using them, doing programs, using social media to get people out there, even if it's a tiny portion of what we actually what's actually being used, just calling attention to what's out there, I think raised the profile enough to get people in power talking about the benefits of trails. Things like the Long Trail, the work that Alaska Trails and you've done to call attention to statewide the benefits that trails can provide. And a lot of that work happens on the shoulders of these nonprofits, on your partners. That's a major role of the partners, is to scream and say, we love trails, this is great, and we want more. It's hard to make that happen internally. It's hard for staff to do that. We can't go to an assembly meeting and take up the 90 seconds to, talk about our programs and appear to feather your own nest. Like, it needs to come from partners. And so I'd just advocate for that role as, partners as advocates to take us to the next step.
So there's a couple other categories of questions on here, and maybe jumping to the bottom one there. And Chris, Chris Myrtle touched on this. What we've tried to, in thinking about this, it's not just trail construction, not just trail maintenance, not just crew leaders, but it's also the activities that precede that. Some of that's the planning process, the outreach process. Some of it gets to the actual point of trail design, permits, environmental approvals. That whole category is currently under the capacity of what it needs to be. And I'm wondering if, and maybe this, Ryan, is back to you, if you're seeing that as if that's a true statement, that that whole pipeline that leads from a glimmer in the eye to somebody out working on a trail, are you seeing the Forest Service or other public land management entities being open to expanding the opportunities to fill those slots in the process that produces a trail? It's kind of a complicated question, but I know there's been some discussion about that down in the Tongass. I don't know. Any thoughts on that long, blurry question?
Yeah. You know, I think yes and no is my short answer. So looking at Trail Mix and the success that we've had with our staff, you know, we've seen people, as we've started building in more programming that we really experienced in the CCC in 2020 into our regular seasons. We're building in wilderness first aid certifications, chainsaw certifications, all these things that we would kind of do as we could before are now like a core part of our programming. And not only are we seeing higher retention, we're seeing more applicants for jobs. We have the total opposite of the national narrative about not being able to find folks to work for 2 years running now. But we're also seeing some of our crew members who do move on into positions with the Forest Service, move into you know, planning roles at the municipal level. We have a crew leader who is part of the CCC is working as a GIS technician with the city. So we definitely are seeing folks go from trail work and get this appreciation of trail work and going into these other roles. And like Elizabeth mentioned earlier, you know, even if somebody doesn't go into one of those roles, that's an experience working on a trail crew, something that stays with you. And whatever pursuit you take through life, you know, that acknowledgement of trail work and working with the land for public benefit is something that stays with people and can have a big impact through any field. That's a more in the ether than you were asking. The Forest Service here on the Tongass is really reinvesting in recreation positions, and it's awesome. And I'm so excited about it. You know, we're seeing positions that have been vacant for 15 years be advertised and be posted. And that's great. And that's definitely a step in the right direction. And a great way to utilize this fire hose of funding that Chris Myrtle referenced. It still takes partnerships. And I think it still takes creating capacity and creating these counterpart positions, these nonprofit positions to implement, right? To implement, to plan, and to be community members who are really invested in this. So
yeah.
Yes, I think that, you know, we've seen success since we've sort of reshaped our vision for workforce development and for job skills training. And we've seen our crew members have success and go into fields. And I really think they'll carry their time on the trails with them into those things. But I think there's a lot more work to be done. Yeah.
So we've indulged in taking 15 minutes out of your lunch. So why don't we see if we wrap up the next 2-3 minutes? I see, Chris, you've got your hand up. Maybe just before we come to you, would any of the panelists like to share a final thought? And I'm going to have Steve share a final thought as well. But Ben or Elizabeth, Brian, any last thoughts before we take it to Chris and then wrap up?
All good here. No.
Brian, Elizabeth, any bursts of insight or things you'd like to share before we wrap up?
I just want to thank you for putting this on. Thanks, Alaska Trails, and thanks for having me.
Well, we appreciate you being here. Your programs are enviable and seem like they're the start of bigger things to come. So thank you for making time, you and Laurel and the team.
Yeah,
Bring on the
thanks.
fire
Thanks.
hose.
Thanks to the other presenters too, just for great examples of something to work forward to.
And maybe Chris, a quick Myrtle thought from you, and then Steve and I will wrap up.
I didn't really have anything to add other than just saying thank you to everybody. I've really enjoyed the presentation. I can't speak for the Forest Service, but I know that there's at least 3 landscape architecture positions that are open. They don't have a regional landscape architect. When I worked for the Forest Service, there's 30 some landscape architects. They're down to less than a dozen.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden this money is here, but they have
Yeah.
no staff to manage it, no CORs, no COs. And so they're going to need us to help them out. And we're ready. Let's do it. You know,
Yeah.
we've all got the expertise. Let's work collaboratively. Let's put the right people in the right position that puts a smile on our face, that we're not doing the grudging stuff that we don't like doing. And let's make the best of this situation, because we can't sit around and wait, because it's going to go somewhere else. But anyway, also Ryan, thanks for being in my backyard, buddy. You do great work. And I really appreciate everybody else's input tonight. Thank you.
Well, a thought, and Chris, you set it up. I mean, I think the discussion we're having right now is incredibly important. And Alaska Trails is engaged through the Alaska Trail Stewards program. It's more focused in South Central right now. But I think statewide, the fire hose is there, the need is there. And what's going to turn out to be, I think, suddenly one of the bigger challenges to doing what needs to be done is the very suite of issues we're talking about right now. I'm just repeating what people have been saying. So I think through Alaska Trails, that organization, our organization, is going to continue to try to focus attention on this. And I think I'd had lessons learned and next steps. Next steps is I think that there needs to be a more concerted, thoughtful effort on how we collectively address this. And I am, you know, one of my tendencies / flaws is like, more meetings are great, but it would be good to pull together the people that are talking and thinking about this now and evaluate how collectively we might be able to do some of the things Chris Myrtle was talking about, how we are going to learn from one another, build capacity, solve some problems. And the groups that have been successful, like those that have been on our panel, can be big contributors to that. And we need to bring in more folks, because we don't want to have the fire hose end up like shooting off in the woods someplace and not doing any good, whatever that metaphor would be. We don't want to miss this opportunity, because it might not be always around. So I don't know. Steve, do you have any final thoughts on how Alaska Trails would contribute to all this before we go have lunch?
Well, I appreciate the discussion. I wanted to say thanks to all the presenters, and thanks again to you, Chris, for facilitating it. I appreciate Chris Myrtle's thoughts about the planning. Niels Andreessen of the Alaska Municipal League yesterday counseled taking a deep breath and realizing that while the funding is coming now, it's also at least some of the funding has a more extended time period. So I think it's smart for all of us to continue planning and meeting and talking about this and sharing solutions that will work. And so I'm excited about the future and definitely continuing this this conversation. And I'll just plug the last two sessions for the conference. As Bob mentioned in the chat, he'll be on at 1 o'clock talking about trail building in Southeast. So more nuts and bolts stuff, but a good session on what it takes to build trails in Southeast. And then we have adaptive mountain bikes and trail building commensurate with that at 2:45. So we hope you will join us for both of those. But thanks again to our panelists, and thanks to all the attendees today.
Yeah, enjoy your lunch. Thanks, everybody.
Take care. Thanks again.